Marcus makes $72,000 a year, has $6,200 saved, and genuinely believes he's doing okay. He's not. He's just not in trouble yet. He has $8,400 in credit card debt, a $580 car payment, and a bank app that calls his savings on track, which is the financial equivalent of a doctor telling you your cholesterol is fine right before the stress test. Marcus isn't irresponsible. He just lives in 2026, where everything costs more than it did 3 years ago. Rent ate his raise before he could save it. Then doing okay quietly became the new broke. Now here's what Marcus doesn't know. The scientists who track how close humanity is to catastrophic war just moved their clock to 85 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. The last nuclear arms treaty between the US and Russia expired in February. There are now 0 legal limits on either arsenal. And if something goes seriously wrong in the world, Marcus's $6,200 is not a safety net. It's a speed bump. My name is Nick, and today we're going to talk about the number that actually keeps you alive when the world stops working. Before we get into the math, I need to establish something that most finance content completely ignores. The world is genuinely more dangerous right now than it has been since the Cold War. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has tracked nuclear risk since 1947. Their doomsday clock just hit 85 seconds to midnight, the closest in nearly 80 years of keeping score. Now, Russia-Ukraine has no resolution in sight, and hybrid warfare against NATO infrastructure has moved from covert to open secret. Tensions in the South China Sea have escalated from warnings to near daily intercepts. In the Middle East, we watched proxy conflicts threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz, spiking shipping costs globally. And perhaps most terrifyingly, we saw nuclear rhetoric normalize. The taboo against discussing tactical nukes didn't just erode in 2025, it vanished. We are currently living through the highest number of simultaneous conflicts since 1945. 2 nuclear powers were a single miscalculation away from something that has never happened before. The money trail confirms what the words are saying. Global military spending shattered records in 2024 and kept climbing through 2025, the steepest sustained rise since the Cold War ended. Governments don't spend money like that because things are going well. A February 2026 poll found that 46% of Americans believe a world war is likely within 5 years. That number was 38% a year earlier. It's moving in one direction. I am not predicting World War III. Nobody can. What I am saying is that every serious institution tracking global risk is sending the same signal. And Marcus, sitting there with $6,200 in a car payment, is completely unprepared for what even a moderate version of that signal looks like in practice. Let's talk about what war actually does to your money, not in theory. In documented, specific, this actually happened history. Start with Germany after World War I. Germany financed the entire war through borrowing. The result was the Weimar hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923, one of the most complete destructions of a middle class in modern history. A German schoolteacher named Anna Eisenmenger kept a diary through the period. She watched her life savings, money she'd deposited faithfully for decades, become worth less than the paper it was printed on. A student ordered coffee at a cafe for 5,000 marks. By the time he finished and ordered another, the price had gone up to 7,000. Women burned banknotes for heat because cash was cheaper than kindling. That is not a metaphor. That is what happens to savings when a government loses control of its currency under wartime pressure. World War II played out differently depending on where you stood. In occupied France and the Netherlands, black market prices for basic goods rose 400 to 600%. Civilians sold furniture, jewelry, and land at whatever price the buyer was willing to pay because eating this week mattered more than fair market value. In Germany, when currency reform came in 1948, the government cut the money supply by 93% overnight. 10 Reichsmarks became 1 Deutsche Mark. If you'd spent your entire working life putting savings in a bank, you woke up one morning and 90% of it was gone. By government decree, before breakfast. The consistent pattern across every conflict is this: Currencies collapse, savings evaporate, and the people who survive financially share three characteristics. They held tangible assets, they maintained access outside the domestic banking system, and they acted before the window closed. And that last part is the most important thing in this video. Here's the window. Pay attention to this because this is the part nobody talks about. Every financial crisis in modern history has featured the government locking you out of your own money. Capital controls, bank freezes, asset confiscation, forced currency conversions, and in every single case, the controls happened suddenly, with little warning, and the window to move assets before they slammed shut was measured in days, not months. In days. FDR signed Executive Order 6102 in April 1933, requiring every American to hand over their gold within 28 days in exchange for $20.67 per ounce. The penalty for not complying was up to 10 years in prison. After collecting the gold, FDR revalued it to $35 per ounce, a 69% markup that transferred wealth directly from American citizens to the federal government. The ban lasted 41 years. Your grandfather wasn't legally allowed to own gold from the time he was a young man until he was collecting Social Security. Argentina, 2001. The government froze every bank account in the country overnight. They called it the Corralito, which is a charming name for what was essentially a legal mugging. Then, while your money was locked up, they forcibly converted your dollar-denominated deposits to pesos at a rate that gave you roughly 35 cents on the dollar. 30 people died in the protests that followed. The government called it a necessary financial stabilization measure, which is what governments call it when they take your money and there's nothing you can do about it. Cyprus, 2013. The EU, the IMF, and the ECB, the most respectable financial institutions on Earth, signed off on seizing 47.5% of all bank deposits over 100,000 euros. Not taxing, seizing. Banks closed for 12 days, capital controls lasted 2 years, and then there's Lebanon. And starting in 2019, Lebanese banks froze accounts with zero legal authorization. They just did it, because they could. Dollar deposits were converted to lira at rates that gave depositors about 10 cents per dollar. The Lebanese pound lost 98% of its value. An estimated $170 billion in deposits is now effectively trapped in a bankrupt banking system. Citizens have walked into banks with guns to withdraw their own money for cancer treatment. That is the sentence I want you to read again. As people robbed banks, their own banks, to access their own money for medical care. Marcus has $6,200 in a U.S. bank account and considers himself reasonably prepared. I'm not saying the U.S. is Lebanon, I'm saying every person in Cyprus, Greece, and Lebanon thought their banking system was stable right up until the morning it wasn't, so why $100,000? Why not $50,000, which sounds like a lot, or $500,000, which sounds like the serious answer? Because $100,000 is the minimum that covers all four components of actual crisis survival simultaneously. Below it, you're forced to choose between them, which means you're not actually prepared, you just feel like you are. The four components are living expenses over time, relocation costs, an inflation hedge, and rebuilding capital. Average American household spending runs about $6,500 per month. In genuine austerity mode, you can get that to around $3,000. 12 months at $3,000 is $36,000, but if you relocate to a neutral, low-cost country during an extended crisis, the math changes completely. A full year in Georgia, the country, not the state, runs about $1,600 per month for a foreigner. Portugal, now pricier but safe, runs about $2,400. Latin American hubs like Panama or Costa Rica average $2,000, including flights, deposits, visa fees, and setup costs. A complete year abroad in a strategically neutral country runs between $22,000 and $38,000. And that leaves you starting from $100,000 with somewhere between $64,000 and $83,000 still intact after 12 months of genuine crisis survival. And that remaining capital is the most important part of this conversation. Every major crisis in history creates the most extraordinary wealth transfer opportunity of the generation that lived through it. After the 2008 crash, US home prices fell 33% nationally. The S&P 500 dropped 57% peak to bottom. Anyone with liquid capital in March 2009 who bought an index fund made 200% in 5 years. Blackstone bought 80,000 single-family homes at distressed prices and built one of the largest real estate empires in history. They weren't smarter than everyone else, they just had liquidity when everyone else was desperate. $50,000 fails the test. It gets you through the crisis, but leaves you broke at the end. No rebuilding capital, no position to take advantage of distressed assets. Starting from zero in a world where prices are already elevated, $500,000 is wonderful but not a different category. The jump from $50,000 to $100,000 is the transformation. The jump from $100,000 to $500,000 is comfort. Marcus, with his $6,200, isn't just unprepared for the crisis, he's unprepared for the opportunity on the other side of it. Both failures matter. Let me make this more concrete by showing you what happens to people with nothing when things go wrong. Because the crisis math isn't just about finances, it's about options. In the Syrian civil war, the cost of a smuggler boat to Greece was between $1,350 and $2,250 per person. Total minimum cost to reach safety in Europe, roughly $3,000 per person. For families living on $85 per month in a refugee camp, that number was simply unreachable. They didn't choose to stay, and they literally could not afford to leave. In Ukraine, after the 2022 invasion, an estimated 130,000 Ukrainians returned to Russian-occupied Donbass despite the obvious dangers. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't financially sustain being displaced. They went back because staying away was more expensive than the risk of going home. War doesn't create financial inequality, it reveals and amplifies the inequality that already exists. People who couldn't afford to leave Syria didn't create the Syrian civil war. They just had no margin to survive it. Marcus won't be choosing between smugglers and occupied territory, but he will be choosing between options and no options. And that choice gets made years before the crisis arrives, which means it's being made right now, whether he realizes it or not. So what do you actually do with $100,000 from a crisis readiness standpoint? Because have $100,000 is a destination, not a strategy. The first thing to understand is that cash sitting entirely in a domestic bank account is the worst possible form of crisis asset. Capital controls, bail-ins, forced currency conversions, these are documented recurring features of financial systems under stress. If 100% of your wealth sits in one country's banking system, you have exactly the financial freedom that government decides to give you. During a crisis, that amount is frequently very little and sometimes zero. Gold has the cleanest historical track record of any crisis asset. During Weimar hyperinflation, gold went from 170 marks per ounce to 87 trillion marks per ounce. Those who held it didn't just preserve purchasing power, they ended up with more of it. At peak hyperinflation, you could buy a block of commercial real estate in central Berlin for 25 ounces of gold. That is either the most horrifying or the most compelling sentence in this video, depending on which side of it you were on. As of early 2026, gold is trading near historic highs, breaking the psychological $3,000 barrier, driven by geopolitical tensions that, as we've established, are not calming down. Physical foreign currency, specifically US dollars, is the second proven asset. In Argentina, Lebanon, and Syria, physical dollars became the actual operating currency when local systems failed. The Lebanese example is clarifying. People holding physical cash outside banks retained full value. Those holding bank deposits got 10 cents on the dollar. Same currency, completely different outcome depending on where it was held. Bitcoin has demonstrated real crisis utility in practice. Ukraine raised $212 million in crypto donations after the 2022 invasion. Refugees carried wallets on USB drives across borders. Argentina has the highest crypto adoption in Latin America. not because Argentinians are tech enthusiasts. Because when your government has devalued your currency 8 times in 30 years, you start looking for things it can't touch. The limitation is real. You need working internet and the discipline not to panic sell when everything is on fire. Watching your Bitcoin drop 40% while the news is screaming is the financial equivalent of being told to walk calmly toward the emergency exit. Technically the right move, extremely difficult in practice. The allocation framework for $100,000, $15,000 to $20,000 in immediately liquid cash. 3 months of runway before you've made any decisions, $10,000 to $20,000 earmarked for relocation if needed, $15,000 to $25,000 for living costs abroad, $15,000 to $25,000 in physical gold and foreign currency, and $25,000 to $40,000 as rebuilding capital in low-cost index funds now, ready to be deployed into distressed assets when the crisis creates the opportunity that every crisis creates. Let's talk about Marcus's path from $6,200 to $100,000 because it's a math problem, not a fantasy. Step 1 is boring. The first move is killing the $8,400 in credit card debt at 24% APR. That's a guaranteed negative 24% return on his net worth every single year he carries it. Paying it off is the highest returning move available. Better than the stock market, better than gold, better than anything. Until it's gone, everything else is noise. In step 2 is building $10,000 to $15,000 in a high yield savings account that earns 4 to 5% and does not get touched for anything that isn't a genuine emergency. This money doesn't go in the market, it sits there being boring and preventing the ordinary disasters, the car repair, the medical bill from becoming more credit card debt. Step 3 is aggressive, consistent investment into low-cost index funds. At $1,000 per month with historical market returns, Marcus hits $100,000 in approximately 7 years. At $1,500 per month, 5 years. These timelines compress with any raise that doesn't immediately become a higher car payment. And that's the trap keeping Marcus at $6,200 despite making $72,000. His $580 car payment on a vehicle losing value every day, invested instead at 8% annual returns over 10 years, becomes $106,000. Marcus isn't paying for a car. Marcus is paying $106,000 to drive something that will be worth $8,000. That is the actual transaction he's in. Nobody at the dealership mentioned it. Here's what I want to leave you with. $100,000 in crisis deployable net worth doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't tell you which flashpoint goes hot or whether any of this actually happens. What it gives you is the one thing that every piece of history we looked at today proves is the actual determining factor in who survives a crisis. Options. The option to move before the window closes. The option to sit out a crash market and buy at the bottom. The option to go 18 months without income while the world figures itself out. Every capital control, every bank freeze, every confiscation we discussed had one thing in common. The people who acted before it happened kept their wealth. The people who waited lost it. In every case, there were people who saw the early signals, moved assets, and were fine. And people who assumed the system was stable because it had always been stable, and lost decades of savings in days. Marcus's $6,200 is not savings. It is a false sense of security that will evaporate faster than he can process what's happening if things go seriously wrong. The $100,000 threshold is the number that transforms you from someone who must endure whatever the world decides to do into someone who can choose what happens next. Build it before you need it, because the one thing every crisis has in common is that by the time you realize you should have started, the window is already closing. That's not pessimism. That's just math being honest with you before the world has to be.